The notice was taped to the door at 7 in the morning, and Gloria Vance read it twice before she let herself believe what it said. Rent increase, effective in 30 days. 1,100 to 2,200. Doubled on a two-bedroom unit she had lived in for 11 years, in a building where the boiler still knocked twice before it caught, and the hallway light on the third floor had been out since spring. Gloria stood in the doorway in her work cardigan, keys already in hand for the 6 a.m. bus to the hospital where she'd spent 2 decades as a surgical ward nurse, and read the number a third time to be sure her eyes weren't doing something cruel to her before her coffee had even finished brewing. What she did not know, standing there with the paper trembling slightly in her dark brown hands, her locks pulled back under a grey scarf for her shift, was that 4 floors below her, in a mailbox the landlord hadn't checked in a week, sat a county recorder's notice with a different kind of number on it, a closing statement filed 6 days earlier for 11 properties on that block, including the one she stood in. And what the landlord, a heavy-set white man named Curtis Bohem, who collected rent checks personally because he trusted no one else with the arithmetic, did not know at all yet, was that the buyer's name on that closing statement was one he had heard exactly twice in his life, both times in passing, and had never once connected to the quiet family in Unit 4C who paid on the 1st of every month and never gave him a single reason to remember them. He would learn it soon enough. Everyone on that block would. Gloria Vance had raised her son Marcus alone in that building since he was 6 years old, in a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a walk up on a street called Ellery, in a neighborhood that had spent 30 years being told it wasn't worth investing in, and then, more recently, being told the opposite by men in good suits who wanted it for reasons that had nothing to do with the people already living there. She had worked nights and doubles at the hospital to keep him fed and in decent shoes, and she had done it with a kind of quiet that the building's other tenants had come to depend on, without quite noticing they depended on it, the way she'd sit with old Mrs. Odom on the 2nd floor when her husband died. The way she'd bring soup to whoever was sick that week. The way she never once raised her voice in 11 years, even when the boiler failed in February and Curtis Bohm took 4 days to send anyone out to fix it. She was 59 that spring. Her hands, when she worked, moved with the particular economy of a woman who had spent 31 years managing surgical trays and post-op dressings, quick and sure and unhurried all at once. The same steadiness she brought to folding laundry or filling out the rent check on the 1st, the same steadiness that did not leave her, even now, holding a notice that would have made a younger woman scream. She did not scream. She read it a 3rd time, folded it along its existing creases, and went to work. Marcus Vance had grown up on that same street, in that same building, sleeping some winters in a coat because the heat ran thin, watching his mother come home grey with exhaustion from 12-hour shifts and still find the energy to check his homework at the kitchen table before either of them slept. He was 34 now, 6'2", built lean and broad through the shoulders, in the way of a man who had once played college ball before a knee injury ended that particular dream and sent him looking for another one. His skin a deep amber brown, his head shaved close, a neat line of a beard he kept trimmed the way he kept everything trimmed. With intention, nothing wasted, nothing left to chance. He wore, most days, plain button shirts and slacks that cost more than they looked like they cost, because he had learned early that the wrong kind of visible money made rooms close instead of open, and he had spent the better part of 10 years learning exactly which rooms he needed open. He had not told his mother what he did for a living, not the whole of it, not yet. She knew he was in real estate. She thought that meant he sold houses. What Marcus Vance actually did that spring was close on 11 adjoining properties along Ellery Street for $14,200,000, financed through a fund he'd spent 6 years building with two partners he'd met not at a country club, but at a community college night class in property law, back when he was 24 and working days as a leasing agent for a company that wouldn't let him pass the front desk without a name tag that made white collars assume he was there to fix the copier. He had learned the business from the bottom of it, the way his mother had learned nursing from the bottom of hers, and by 34, he had a license, a farm, a track record of quietly buying distressed blocks before anyone else recognized what they'd become, and a habit, inherited, though he rarely said from whom, of never once forgetting where he came from, while he built toward where he was going. He kept, in the top drawer of his desk, at the small downtown office he rented under his own name, a single object that never left that drawer, except on the days he needed reminding why he was doing any of it. A spiral notebook, cardboard cover gone soft at the corners. In his late father's handwriting, 3/4 full of numbers and notes from a man who had spent 20 years managing a small apartment, building 2 towns over, before a stroke took him at 51, back when Marcus was 19, and just starting to understand what his father had actually been trying to teach him on Sunday afternoons. Walking the halls of that building with a clipboard, checking gutters and boilers, and the particular way a tenant's face changed when they were about to say they couldn't make rent that month. Reginald Vance had been a broad-shouldered man with skin the color of dark cedar and hands permanently rough at the knuckles from 30 years of fixing what tenants couldn't afford to have fixed themselves. A man who wore the same grey work jacket through 2 decades of winters because a new one felt like money better spent on his son's shoes. He had never owned the building he managed. He had wanted to, badly, quietly, for 20 years, and had died $5,000 short of the down payment a bank would have required, even if the bank had been willing to lend to him at all. Which in that era, in that neighborhood, it mostly was not. He had said one thing to Marcus more than any other, standing in a stairwell with a flashlight, checking a fuse box, that had lodged itself so deep in his son that it came back to him unbidden at least once a week for the rest of his life. Marcus remembered those Sunday walks the way other men remembered church, a ritual with its own liturgy, its own particular smell of cinder block and old paint, his father's flashlight beam sliding along a gutter joint or a fuse panel, while he explained, in the unhurried cadence of a man who genuinely believed a 14-year-old could understand anything if you gave him the time, why a landlord who let a roof go too long paid triple for it later, why a tenant behind on rent almost always had a story worth hearing before you had a number worth quoting them. Reginald had kept a leather-bound ledger for the building he managed, entries in a hand so careful it looked almost typeset, and once, when Marcus asked why he bothered writing so neatly in a book nobody but him would ever read, his father had set the pen down and looked at him a long moment. Because somebody's got to prove, on paper, that we did it right, Reginald said. Words disappear the second you stop saying them. Paper doesn't. You remember that, and you'll never be at the mercy of anybody's memory but your own. You don't own a building by holding the keys. You own it by holding the paper. Everything else is just permission somebody can take back. Marcus had been 17 when he first heard it and hadn't understood it. He understood it fully by 26, the year he closed on his first property, a 4-unit building 2 blocks from where his father used to work. Using a loan he'd spent 3 years positioning himself to qualify for. Reading every real estate finance textbook the community college library had, and half of what the downtown law library had besides. Learning the difference between a lease and a deed, between a tenant's rights and an owner's leverage, between the kind of power that could be revoked by someone else's mood and the kind that was recorded in a county office and could not. He had never told his mother about the notebook, or about the drawer, or about how many nights he'd sat with his father's handwriting open in front of him while he studied for exams that would eventually let him buy, quietly, an entire street. The mechanics of real estate finance had not come easily to him. He had failed his first attempt at a commercial lending certification at 25, sat with the rejection letter for 2 days before he opened the notebook again, and found, in the margin of an entry about a tenant dispute from 1991, his father's small aside about a different kind of failure. A closed door just means you used the wrong key. Doesn't mean there isn't one. He had gone back to the same exam 5 months later, having rebuilt his understanding of debt structuring and underwriting from the ground up, teaching himself in libraries and community college night classes what men with different last names learned by osmosis at family dinner tables. And he had passed the second time by a margin wide enough that the instructor asked him, only half joking, whether he'd been holding back the first attempt on purpose. He had not corrected her. Some corrections cost more than they are worth to make in a room that isn't ready to hear them. The rent notice on Gloria's door was Curtis Boehm's second escalation that year, though Gloria had no way of knowing it fit any kind of pattern until much later. The first had come 4 months earlier, a notice about a late fee she disputed and won. Technically, though winning it had cost her an afternoon off work she couldn't afford to lose, and a conversation with Bohm in the building's cramped ground floor office that left her rattled in a way she didn't mention to Marcus, because she had spent her whole life absorbing things quietly rather than handing her worry to her son to carry. Curtis Bohm was 52, thick through the middle, in the way of a man who ate lunch standing up and resented anyone who made him explain himself twice. And he ran 4 buildings on Ellery Street, the way his father had run them before him, which was to say with a ledger, a temper he considered reasonable, and a set of assumptions about which tenants would fight a rent hike and which would simply pack up and go quietly rather than make trouble. He had watched the neighborhood 2 streets over triple its rents in 5 years, once a coffee shop and a gym moved in, and he had decided, over a series of conversations with a broker who kept calling about redevelopment potential, that Ellery Street's day had come, and that the fastest way to clear his buildings for a sale to that broker's clients was to make staying expensive enough that people left on their own. No eviction proceedings required. No lawyers, no mess. He had picked his targets with a kind of arithmetic he never wrote down anywhere, because writing it down would have made it something he'd have to answer for. Gloria Vance, single, older, a renter of 11 years with no lease clause protecting her from a market rate reset, was, in his private accounting, an easy mark. He did not think of it as prejudice. He thought of it as reading the market. The same self-deceiving phrase men like him always reached for, when the truth was plainer and uglier than that. He was wrong about exactly one thing, and it was the only thing that mattered. If you've ever watched someone absorb an unfairness quietly, because fighting it seemed more dangerous than swallowing it, you already know the particular weight Gloria carried up 4 flights of stairs that evening, notice folded in her cardigan pocket, deciding how much of it to tell her son, and how much to carry alone the way she'd carried nearly everything else for 11 years. She told him 3 days later, on a Sunday, over the pot roast she made every week, whether he came by or not, because some habits outlast the reasons a person started them. She slid the folded notice across the table, without much preamble, the way she handed him report cards to sign when he was young enough to still need a parent's signature on things. Doubling, she said, 1100 to 22, 30 days. Marcus read it once, and something in his face went very still in a way his mother recognized from his childhood, the same stillness he used to get right before a hard decision, quiet on the outside and working fast underneath. He did not raise his voice. He asked her 3 questions, flat and precise. How long had she lived there? Had Boehm given any written reason? And had anyone else in the building gotten a similar notice? She didn't have complete answers to the 3rd one, only that Mrs. Odom on the 2nd floor had mentioned something similar in the hallway that week, and that the young couple in 2A had already started asking around about apartments in a cheaper part of the city. "I don't know what I'll do," Gloria said, and it was the closest she came in that whole conversation to letting him see how frightened she actually was. "I can't make $2,200 a month, Marcus, not on what the hospital pays." "You're not going to have to," Marcus said, and something in the flatness of it, the certainty, made her look at him a bit longer than the sentence alone would have earned, though she let it go. Because a son telling his mother not to worry was not, in her experience, usually worth taking literally. What Marcus did not tell her that Sunday, because the closing hadn't finalized yet, and he had learned the hard way not to promise anything he couldn't yet put a deed behind, was that he had been quietly assembling the properties on Ellery Street for the better part of 14 months, working through a title company 2 states removed from anyone who might recognize his name, buying up mortgage notes and, in 3 cases, entire buildings from owners eager to sell before the neighborhood's rising interest made holding costs worse than cutting losses. He had bought the block not because he'd known his mother's building would be on it. He hadn't known that when he started, the deals having come to him through brokers and note holders long before he'd mapped the addresses against his own childhood. But because Ellery Street was exactly the kind of block his father used to walk with a flashlight and a clipboard. Exactly the kind of block a man like Curtis Baum had spent years treating as inventory instead of as somebody's home. When he finally cross-referenced the addresses against the closing schedule 3 weeks before his mother's notice ever went up, and saw her building's number on the list of 11, he had sat alone in his office a long while, the notebook open on the desk in front of him, his father's handwriting steady under the desk lamp. You don't own a building by holding the keys. You own it by holding the paper. He had not called his mother that night. He had called his attorney instead and told her to move the closing up by 2 weeks if the title company could manage it, because he had a feeling, though he couldn't yet have said why, that time was going to matter. The closing finalized on a Tuesday. Curtis Boehm's rent notice went up on Gloria's door the following Thursday, 3 days later, which meant that for those 3 days, though neither of them yet knew it, Curtis Boehm had been serving eviction by price notices on tenants in a building he no longer legally owned. What would you have done in Gloria's place? Kept your head down and started packing? Or trusted that 30 days was long enough for something to change? Gloria did neither exactly. She kept working her shifts, kept paying attention to Mrs. Odom, and kept the folded notice in her cardigan pocket like a stone she couldn't quite set down, because she had learned over 59 years that hope handled carelessly could cost more than it gave back. The escalation came 12 days later, and it was worse than the notice, because it was public. Gloria had gone down to the ground floor office that Saturday to ask Boehm directly whether the increase was negotiable, whether there was any payment plan, any grace period, anything at all, and she had brought Marcus with her. Not because she needed protecting, but because he had insisted, in the flat, certain tone she was learning not to argue with. Boehm kept them standing in the small office lobby, among 3 other tenants waiting to pay rent, and when Gloria asked a question, quiet and measured the way she asked everything, he answered loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I've got 15 people who'd pay $2,200 for that unit without blinking," Boehm said, not quite looking at her. Addressing instead some middle distance above her head, the way a man does when he has decided a person isn't worth his full attention. "You've had a good run at below market rent for 11 years. That's not a promise, that's a courtesy, and courtesies end. If it's a hardship, there's shelters that take referrals. I'm not running a charity here." The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone in it recognizes cruelty, and no one wants to be the one who names it out loud. One of the waiting tenants, a young black man in his 20s named Terence, who'd lived on the 4th floor 2 doors from Gloria for a year and had never once had a real conversation with her beyond a nod in the stairwell, looked down at his phone in his hand and, almost without deciding to, started recording. He didn't know yet why. He just knew, watching Boehm's face, watching Gloria's carefully composed stillness, that this felt like something worth having proof of. Marcus did not raise his voice either. That was in its way the most dangerous thing in the room, though only he and his mother understood it yet. "You said 15 people," Marcus said, quiet, even. "Would you be willing to put that number and today's date in writing?" Boehm looked at him properly for the first time, sizing him up the way he sized up every young black man who walked into his office, and made the same mistake he'd made with Gloria, reading confidence as a problem to be managed rather than a fact to be respected. "I don't owe you paperwork," Boehm said. "I don't even know who you are." "You will," Marcus said, and it wasn't a threat exactly, not in tone. It was closer to a fact being stated ahead of its own arrival, the way a man says rain's coming when he can already smell it on the wind, and something about the stillness under it made Boehm's jaw tighten, in a way that told everyone in that lobby, even the ones who couldn't have said why, that they had just watched something shift. Mrs. Odom, 81, small and silver-haired, her own skin a warm russet gone soft and creased with the decades, had watched the whole exchange from a folding chair near the mailboxes, where she liked to sit some mornings for the company of the lobby, and she caught Gloria's arm gently on the way to the stairs. "That man talked to you like you were asking him for a favor," she said low, so only Gloria could hear. 11 years of rent checks isn't a favor. It's a debt he owes you as much as you owe him. Gloria squeezed her hand and didn't trust herself to answer, because Mrs. Odom's kindness, arriving right then, threatened to undo the composure she'd spent the whole lobby scene holding together. Gloria's hands trembled slightly on the walk back up the stairs, though she didn't let her son see it until they reached her apartment, and she sat down hard at the kitchen table, the adrenaline of composure finally spending itself now that there was no one left to perform it for. "I don't want you fighting my battles, Marcus," she said. "I've handled worse than Curtis Baum." "I know you have," Marcus said, and sat down across from her, and for a moment let himself be 19 again, in a different kitchen, listening to a father explain a lesson he wouldn't fully understand for years. "This isn't me fighting your battle, Mama. This is me finishing something Daddy started and never got the chance to finish. Give me 2 weeks." She didn't fully understand what he meant by that, not that night, though she filed it away the way she filed most things her son said in that particular register, carefully, without pressing, trusting a patience in him that had been built, she suspected, out of watching her own patience her whole life. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest of the whole ordeal, though on the surface almost nothing happened. Gloria kept working her shifts. Boehm, perhaps sensing he'd overplayed his hand in the lobby, sent no further notices, but the silence itself had its own weight. The waiting for the other consequence to land the way waiting for a diagnosis is sometimes worse than the diagnosis itself. She lay awake some nights, doing arithmetic she already knew the answer to, 2,200 against a nurse's salary, against savings that would carry her 4 months at most, against the humiliation of asking her son for money she'd spent his whole childhood making sure he never had to give her. It was on one of those nights, unable to sleep, that she took out the one photograph she kept of Reginald in the nightstand drawer. The two of them younger than Marcus was now, standing outside the apartment building he'd managed and never owned, and she thought about how much of her son's calm certainty she recognized in that photograph's stillness, a steadiness passed down through a man neither of them had had nearly long enough. Marcus, in that same stretch of 2 weeks, was not idle. He met twice with his attorney to finalize the property transfers into the operating entity that would formally manage the block, arranged for a title search that confirmed, cleanly, without a single lien or dispute, that all 11 buildings on Ellery Street now belonged, on paper, to a company called Reginald Holdings LLC, named for a father who had never gotten to see a single deed with his own name on it. He drove past his mother's building twice that week without going in, sitting in his car at the curb a while each time, looking up at the fourth-floor window where a light was usually on too late because she still couldn't sleep well the nights before an early shift. He was, in those 2 weeks, doing what his father had never gotten the chance to do, holding the paper and deciding, carefully, exactly how and when to use it. He rehearsed the meeting in his head more times than he would have admitted to anyone, running through the sequence of documents the way his father used to run through a checklist before signing off on a repair. Deed first. Then the false ownership claim, then the rent history, each piece building on the one before it, so no single fact could be dismissed as coincidence. He practiced saying it without heat, because heat was the one thing that would let a man like Bohem reframe the whole confrontation as an angry young man making a scene instead of a landlord who had broken the law. His father's ledger discipline had taught him that the most dangerous thing you could hand an aggressor was an excuse to change the subject, and he intended to give Bohem none. He called his attorney a second time that week, not about the filing, but about sequencing, which document to lead with, which to hold in reserve, how to structure the meeting so that every fact landed in an order the room could follow without him needing to raise his voice even once. You only get one room like this, his attorney told him. Don't waste the good exhibit early. Marcus already knew that. His father had taught him the same lesson decades earlier, standing over a fuse box. Though the words back then had been about wiring instead of documents, never show a man the breaker until you've shown him the wire that's actually burning. The overreach came on a Friday, and it was the mistake that ended Curtis Boehm's hold on Ellery Street entirely, though he would not understand that until the following Tuesday. Bohem, frustrated that Gloria hadn't yet given notice she was leaving and irritated by what he perceived, wrongly, as her son's empty bravado in the lobby, decided to accelerate matters. He filed a formal notice of lease violation against Gloria's unit, citing an unauthorized occupant, Marcus, who had stayed over twice in 2 weeks, helping his mother sort through what to keep and what to store. On a fold-out couch, the way any grown son might when his mother was going through something difficult, and attached to the notice a demand that she vacate within 7 days or face formal eviction proceedings. A wildly disproportionate response to 2 nights of a family member's presence, and one that, crucially, he filed and served through the county courts using his own name as the property's honor of record, a status that had not in fact been true for going on 3 weeks. He signed it Curtis Boehm, owner Ellery Street Properties, on a legal document filed with the county clerk's office, swearing under penalty of perjury to a fact that a simple record search would have shown was false. The night that notice arrived, taped again to the door the way the first one had been. Gloria sat at her kitchen table with both notices spread in front of her, the rent hike and the eviction threat, and let herself, for the first time in the whole ordeal, feel the full weight of it instead of managing it. She took out the photograph of Reginald again and the copy of the trembling first notice and thought about 11 years of first-of-the-month checks, of soup carried to Mrs. Odom, of a boiler that took 4 days to fix in February, and wondered, in the particular dark honesty of 2 in the morning, whether all of it, the quiet, the patience, the not making trouble, had bought her anything at all, or whether some rooms simply weren't built to let a woman like her win, no matter how carefully she played it. She thought of something Reginald used to say to her, back when they were young and broke and hopeful in a different apartment altogether, a version of the same sentence their son now carried, folded into his own certainty, though she didn't yet know that. You don't own anything by being quiet about wanting it. But that night, alone at the table with 2 pieces of paper meant to erase her from a home she'd kept for 11 years, the sentence felt less like guidance and more like an accusation, as though her whole strategy of enduring instead of fighting had been, all along, exactly the wrong lesson to have learned from him. She did not call Marcus that night. She sat with it until the sky started to lighten, and then she got ready for her shift, because the hospital did not care what letters had been taped to her door, and the patients on her ward needed her hands steady regardless of what her heart was doing underneath them. Marcus learned about the eviction filing the next morning, forwarded to him by the quiet ally he hadn't fully realized he'd made, Terence from the 4th floor, who had kept the video from the lobby confrontation and, seeing the new notice taped to Gloria's door on his way out that morning, had photographed it and texted it to Marcus with a single line, "This isn't right, man. Let me know if you need anything." He'd gotten Marcus's number from Gloria weeks before, after she'd mentioned in the stairwell that her son was helping her look into her options, and Terence, 26, and working 2 jobs of his own to afford a city that seemed determined to price him out too, had filed that number away, the way you file away a person who might someday need a witness. Marcus read the eviction notice twice, then read Bohem's sworn assertion of ownership a 3rd time, and felt something in his chest that was not quite anger, because anger would have been easy, would have been almost a relief. What he felt instead was the colder, more useful clarity his father used to describe from the stairwells of a building he never owned. The moment a problem stops being a feeling and becomes a plan. He called his attorney. He asked for a formal notice to be prepared and served on Curtis Bohem, informing him that Ellery Street Properties and all 11 of its constituent buildings, including the one at the center of his fraudulent eviction filing, had been under new ownership, Reginald Holdings LLC, for 3 weeks, and that Bohem's continued collection of rent. His filing of legal notices under a false claim of ownership and his eviction proceeding against a tenant of a building he did not own exposed him to both civil liability and potential criminal referral for filing a false sworn statement with the county. But Marcus did not want this handled quietly, by letter, in a way that let Bohem slip out a side door the way men like him always tried to. He wanted the room, the same room. He called a meeting, framed to Bohem's own leasing office, through his attorney, as a mandatory session for all Ellery Street tenants regarding upcoming property management changes, and scheduled it for the following Tuesday evening, in the same ground floor lobby where Bohem had told his mother, in front of a room of witnesses, that courtesies end. The lobby was fuller than usual that Tuesday, word having moved the way it does on a block, where everyone already suspects something's coming, even before they know what. Gloria sat near the front, Marcus beside her, the folded rent notice and eviction filing in a manila envelope in her lap, though she hadn't asked him what, exactly, he planned to do with them. Terence stood near the back, with his phone out again, recording, this time not from instinct, but because Marcus had asked him to, quietly, the day before, and told him this one was worth keeping too. Mrs. Odom sat in a folding chair someone had brought down for her. The young couple from 2A, who'd already started apartment hunting elsewhere, came anyway, curious despite themselves. Curtis Baum arrived at 6:15, 15 minutes late, in the same blazer he wore to collect rent checks, expecting, evidently, a routine meeting about maintenance schedules or a change of contractors. He stood at the front of the room near the mailboxes, the same spot he'd stood weeks before telling a room full of tenants about courtesies ending. And it took him a full 30 seconds of scanning the assembled faces to understand that this gathering had a different shape than the one he'd been told to expect. Marcus stood, unhurried, a slim leather folder in one hand, and did not raise his voice. "Most of you know me as Gloria Vance's son," he said. "Some of you have lived in these buildings longer than I've been alive. I want to keep this simple, because everyone here has somewhere to be, and because Mr. Bohem, in particular, has a court filing due this week that he might want to reconsider before he spends more money defending it." Bohem's jaw did the thing it had done in the lobby 3 weeks earlier, tightening, though his voice, when it came, tried for its old register of dismissal. "I don't know what this is," he said, "but I run these buildings, and I didn't authorize a tenant meeting about anything, except, you haven't run these buildings in 3 weeks, Marcus said, and opened the folder. He read the closing date first, a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 2 days earlier, and the recording number from the county clerk's office. The kind of detail that means nothing to a room of tenants, but means everything to a man whose entire authority in that lobby had, until that sentence, rested on an assumption nobody had thought to check. He named the buyer entity, Reginald Holdings LLC, and watched Boehm's face do the arithmetic a half-second behind the words, the particular color a man goes when he understands, before he's willing to say so out loud, that the ground he's standing on has already been sold out from under him. "You served an eviction notice against my mother 9 days ago," Marcus said, "under penalty of perjury, swearing you were the owner of this property. You weren't. You hadn't been for 3 weeks by the time you signed that filing. That's not a landlord-tenant dispute anymore, Mr. Boehm. That's a false statement on a legal document filed with the county, and I've already forwarded a copy to the District Attorney's Consumer Fraud Division, along with the rent increase notice you served my mother 11 days before that, on a building you did not again own at the time you served it." The room had gone entirely still, the particular stillness of a crowd realizing, all at once, that the thing they'd gathered for was not the thing they'd been told to expect, and that they were about to watch something neither routine nor forgettable happen in front of them. "This is insane," Boehm said, too loud, the volume itself a tell. "I've owned this block for 11 years. I don't know what paperwork you're waving around, but the county recorder's office is 2 blocks from here." Marcus said evenly, "It's open until 5 tomorrow. I'd encourage you to check before you say that to anyone else, because you said it to a room full of witnesses just now, and at least one of them is recording." He didn't look toward the back of the room where Terence stood with his phone raised, and he didn't need to. Boehm's eyes found the phone on their own, and something in his posture changed, the particular collapse of a man realizing the audience for his cruelty had just become the audience for its consequences. Marcus withdrew a single page from the folder, the recorded deed. County seal stamped in the corner, Reginald Holdings LLC listed as grantee, the closing date 3 weeks gone, and set it on the small table by the mailboxes where rent checks were usually collected, in the exact spot Boehm had stood weeks earlier telling Gloria that courtesies end. "My mother has lived in Unit 4C for 11 years, Marcus said. Her rent, going forward, stays at $1,100 a month, same as it's been, for as long as she wants that apartment. Every other tenant in this building and the other 10 on this block keeps their current lease terms unless they choose otherwise. I'm not raising anyone's rent to punish you for what you tried to do, Mr. Boehm. I'm keeping it where it was because that's what these buildings were worth charging before somebody decided the neighborhood's history didn't matter as much as its potential. Have you ever watched someone be erased from a room they thought they controlled, in real time, in front of the very people they'd spent years intimidating? Boehm looked around the lobby then, at faces that had, weeks earlier, stood mute while he humiliated a 59-year-old nurse in front of them, and found no ally anywhere in it, not in the young couple from 2A, not in Mrs. Odom, not in Terence's steady phone, not in Gloria Vance, who sat with her hands folded in her lap and said, for the first time in the entire ordeal, exactly 4 words. "You said courtesies end." Gloria said, quiet even, the same register she'd used asking about a payment plan weeks before. "Mine just did." Boehm did not have a response to that. He left the lobby without another word. Past the same mailboxes, the same faces, the same stairwell, the eviction, the reverse of what he'd tried to serve on her 9 days earlier, not by force. Not by anyone laying a hand on him, but by a room's collective withdrawal of the authority he had, until that moment, assumed was permanently his. The district attorney's Consumer Fraud Division opened a formal inquiry the following week, and Boehm's attorney, 3 days after that, contacted Marcus's firm to negotiate a resolution rather than risk a criminal referral proceeding to charges. A resolution that included Boehm's immediate and permanent removal from any role managing the buildings he'd already lost, a formal retraction of the eviction filing entered into the county record, and a civil settlement, $60,000, split among the tenants he'd sent rent hike notices to that spring, Gloria's share alone coming to $11,000, which she put, without much discussion, toward a fund she and Marcus had already started talking about creating. Marcus did not gloat in any of it. When his attorney asked during the settlement negotiations whether he wanted to push for the maximum penalty available under the fraud statute, purely as leverage, Marcus said no. I want him gone from every building on this street, and I want the record corrected so nobody else can look up my mother's address and find a lie filed against her name, he said. I don't need him ruined beyond that. I won't do to him what he tried to do to her. That's the difference between us. The grace extended farther than Boehm, though he was the only one who didn't deserve it and got it anyway. The young couple in 2A, who had stood silent in that lobby weeks earlier while Boehm humiliated Gloria and said nothing, came to her door the following week, awkward and apologetic, admitting they'd been too afraid of their own list to speak up. And Gloria, who had spent her whole life being generous with people who'd given her less reason to be, made them a pot of the same soup she'd once carried to Mrs. Odom and told them there was nothing to forgive that they hadn't already fixed by showing up. Terence, the quiet ally whose instinct to start recording in a lobby he had no real stake in, had ended up mattering more than he understood at the time. Got a phone call from Marcus 2 weeks later, not a thank you exactly, though it carried the weight of one, an offer of a paid apprenticeship at Reginald Holdings, learning the property management and finance side of the business from the ground floor the way Marcus himself once had, on a leasing agent's salary that didn't require a name tag apologizing for his presence in the room. You didn't have to record that, Marcus told him, the day he offered it. Most people wouldn't have. You did, twice, without me asking the first time. Felt like somebody needed to see it eventually, Terence said. Didn't figure it would be this fast. In the weeks between the lobby meeting and the settlement, Gloria found herself thinking often of the version of herself that had stood in that same lobby weeks earlier, asking politely about a payment plan, absorbing Boehm's cruelty, because fighting it out loud had seemed at the time like the more dangerous choice. She did not regret the quiet years. She understood now that the quiet had never been weakness, only patience waiting on the right instrument, the way a scalpel waits in a sterile tray for the moment it's actually needed rather than being drawn for every small cut. She said as much to Marcus one evening over the same pot roast, and he only nodded, because it was, in its way, the same thing his father had spent 20 years trying to teach a building full of tenants who rarely had the leverage to act on it. 6 months later, the ground floor office that had once belonged to Curtis Boehm reopened under a small brass plaque that read Reginald Holdings, Ellery Street Management, and beneath it, smaller, a line that most tenants walked past without reading closely on their way to pay rent, though Gloria read it every single time. In memory of Reginald Vance, who taught that a building is only ever as strong as the people inside it. Inside that office, framed and hung where the light caught it in the afternoon, was the spiral notebook, cardboard cover, gone soft at the corners, opened to the page where a father's handwriting from 3 decades earlier sat preserved under glass, the sentence his son had built an entire life around finally resting somewhere it could be read by anyone who needed to hear it. You don't own a building by holding the keys. You own it by holding the paper. Everything else is just permission somebody can take back. Gloria still lived in Unit 4C, rent unchanged, though the hallway light on the third floor got fixed within a week of the new management taking over, and the boiler that used to knock twice before catching had been replaced entirely, quietly, without her having to ask. She had started, that fall, teaching a Saturday class in the same ground floor lobby for tenants across the block who wanted to understand their leases, their rights, and the basic arithmetic of what a landlord could and could not legally do to them. A class funded, in part, by the settlement money and named, at Marcus's insistence, though she'd resisted it at first, the Reginald Vance Tenant Resource Center. Terence sat in the front row of that very first class, notebook of his own open on his knee, taking notes the way a man takes notes when he intends to use them. That's the whole of it, and maybe the only lesson worth carrying out of it. Talent and worth don't announce themselves with the clothes a person wears or the address on their rent check. They live everywhere, quietly, waiting on the paperwork or the moment to catch up to what was already true. Prejudice is a blindfold worn by the person wearing it, not a verdict on the person it's aimed at. And dignity, held long enough and quiet enough, tends to outlast whatever cruelty tries to price it out of the room. Who was the first person who believed in you before anyone else could see it? Tell us below, and tell us where you're listening from. If this story moved you, share it with somebody who's still holding their ground quietly, the way Gloria did. Wherever you are tonight, may the paperwork of your life finally catch up to the truth of you, and may somebody, someday, read your name off a deed and know exactly what it cost you to get there.